Stephanie Sebbing from Quilt Addicts Anonymous, and today I'm going to teach you how to make a soft book. These panels, like the one I have out in front of me, they often come with nursery print lines, and they make a great addition to a nursery and baby quilt that you give at a baby shower. Or I'm making a bunch for my daughter, who's going to be 1 soon. She loves putting books in her mouth, and she loves looking at the pictures, and this one I can wash and clean up when she's done mangling it. And she can't tear the pages because it's fabric. And so they're adorable. They come in all kinds of different themes. This one features the adventures of Bob the Tomato and Larry the Cucumber from VeggieTales, but I've seen them with Mickey Mouse and Winnie the Pooh, and this one that we're making today goes with the fabric that I use for her crib quilt. So let's get started. The first thing you want to do is you want to cut your panel apart, and this is not like cutting for quilting. You're going to cut on the line, and one thing to know before you start doing this is that when they print the panels on the fabric, they rarely print them in a straight line. So if you're used to having square corners and straight lines to cut with for quilting, throw that out the window. It's better to just follow the lines rather than have a nice square cut when it comes to these. We can sort of steam it so it looks a little bit more square once we get it all together, but for right now you just want to cut along the lines. So I'm going to grab my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to start cutting. Now the way each panel has a setup looks a little different. Some have lines to cut along the edge, some have dotted lines. In this case there's a nice black mark, and I want to cut on the edge of that black mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my ruler as best I can along the edge of that black line. And if I have to pull on this fabric underneath a little bit and tug it back this way, that's okay, because again, this is not a precision project. It's not like quilting where you have to have it perfect in order to make it come out right. So once I'm pretty happy with the edge of my ruler being in line with that big black mark, then I'm ready to cut. Now each of these panels, there's going to be usually there's 6 or 8 of them for each block. So you want to cut each of these out individually. So you just keep going around until you've got them all cut out. So if I'm looking here, definitely not square at all with this line, but what's more important is that I'm in line with the edge of this black line here, because that's where the edge of the book is going to be. So I'm just going to keep turning this panel around until I've cut out the entire one. And when you do this, there's usually 3 or 4 panels once you get them all together. So there are 6 or 8, and then you sew them together to create 3 to 4 sets of pages for each book. And that's a pretty good size seam to go through. So you really wouldn't ever want it any thicker than that. And one thing to keep in mind when you're cutting these is that the cover and the back are always going to be a little bit bigger, and that's so the cover can flap or go around the interior pages and be a little bit larger and overhang when you do that. So I've almost got this cut, and again I'm not paying attention. I'm definitely not square when I look at the lines on my rulers, but I'm not worrying about that at all. I'm just making sure that the edge of the ruler is in line with that black mark before I make my cuts. So you want to go ahead and cut out all the panels that are in your soft book until you have them all cut out like this. Alright, I finished cutting out all of my individual panels. I have 8 to make 4 sets of pages for this book. One thing most, but not all, of the panels will come with is an assembly guide, and on it tells you what pages go facing each other. You'll want to make sure that you don't throw that away. Make sure you keep it until you get all your pages together, and use that to make sure you're getting all the pages in the right spot once you sew everything together. So now we have to put batting on one side of each of the pairs that go together. So in my case, my 4/7 pages and my 5/6 are going together. So I can set one of those aside, and then the other one I can lay down to cut a piece of batting for it. And you're going to sew this with the right sides together and the batting on the bottom. And I use for this More batting, and I will have a link to where you can buy this in the blog post that goes along with this video. So look at the bottom in the information to make sure you have the link to get more information about this. It's really thin batting. It's recommended for garments actually, but it's also a little sticky, so it works really great for this project because you don't really have to do a ton of pinning. It just kind of wants to stick to the fabric. It does kind of hold a fold though, so you want to make sure you smooth that out nice and flat as you position your fabric on top of that. And the reason why we're only going to cut it to fit one of the sides of these panels is because likely your other one isn't the exact same shape. It's not like quilting where we cut it to a specific size. Since you're following these lines, they're probably not going to fit together exactly perfectly. So we're going to do some work when we start to pin to make sure that that goes together a little better. But for right now, I have this all laid out. You don't have to pin because it's going to stick to the batting. And then you just want to trim around. So I'm lining up my ruler with that dark edge of the fabric again, and just gonna cut. And you don't have to pick up and reposition every time. You can just move your mat if that's easier for you to cut around. And then just keep doing that until you have squared up all of these sides. Now this next part can be just a tad bit tricky depending on how off kilter the printing of the panel was on your fabric. So what you want to do is you want to lay the fabrics right sides together. Make sure you're following that diagram to make sure you have the right pages going next to each other. And you want to pin the middles together first. It's a little easier to tell on this one here because the pages are different colors, but on this bottom piece I'm going to have to eyeball it a little bit. So I'm just putting a pin right in that center of the top, and then I'm going to kind of eyeball where I think the center is on this block here. Then once I've got that done, then I can pin my corners together. And this is the part where you're really going to be able to tell if your block is off or not. I've got quite a bit to ease in on this top panel as opposed to the bottom one because these panels just weren't printed square on the fabric. And that's okay. This is not an heirloom quilting project. It is a book that is going to be gnawed on and loved, and the kids are just going to love looking at the pictures. So we're going to be able to ease that in as we sew, and you'll never know the difference once you get it all together. Or at least the baby you give it to won't care. They're just going to love playing and looking at the pictures and turning the pages. So once I have those corners done, I go ahead and I did those centers as well. And then you just want to repeat that process on the bottom of your book and then on the sides as well. One thing I want to point out before I start sewing is that these panels are a hot mess. They are wrinkled everywhere, they are not lying flat at all, but that's going to be all right once we sew it together and press it flat. And that's just because when they print the panels on the fabric, they're not square. So if you're used to quilting and everything lying nice and flat, don't expect that with this project. It's not going to happen. Now, a couple of things about my sewing machine that I've set up that are different than when I normally sew. I'm going to use my walking foot for this project. It's because we're putting together 2 layers of fabric and batting, much like a quilt top. So it makes sense to use a walking foot to help everything move together at the same rate. I'm also going to set my sewing machine so that it automatically backs up the stitches when I start and stop. We're going to leave an opening for turning so that we can turn these right side out when we're done sewing them together. And now we're going to get started sewing. So what I'm going to do here is just pick this up, and I'm going to start just before the middle of this panel on the bottom. And I always start on the bottom because we're going to stitch this together by hand when we're done, and it's less noticeable when you do it on the bottom than when you do it on the top. Now you want to sew this with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so if you line it up so that the edge of the fabric is even with the inner metal part of your presser foot, you're going to get about a 1/4 inch. But on some fabrics, like this one, I can really easily tell where a 1/4 inch is because there's a dark line that is right where my stitch line is supposed to be. So now we're going to get started. So I started by reinforcing those stitches. My machine does it automatically, but you might have to put your machine in reverse to do that. And now I'm just going to sew along following that dark line or a 1/4 inch seam if that's what you're using. And I'm just easing in some of this fabric, and to do that, I give it a good tug, and that kind of flattens everything out as you're going through. So I'm holding it real tight on the end with my fingers, and I'm keeping that nice and taut as we head toward that corner. I'm going to pull this needle out so we don't stitch over it, get right into that corner, and then I'm going to make that turn. And then you're going to keep going around until you hit to your 4th corner, and then we need to reinforce the stitches to leave that opening for turning. Alright, so I just sewed around my 4th corner, and then I got to a good stopping point that is about 4 or 5 inches away. I'm going to need to be able to turn everything inside out, so I need a hole that's large enough to fit my hand through. So once I've determined how large that needs to be, I just need to reinforce my quilting stitches. And then you just sew 3 stitches back and 3 stitches forward. And then you can cut your threads and repeat that step with your other panels for your book. Alright, I've sewn all my panels together, and now I've got to clip the corners, and by doing this, it just makes sure that your books are going to turn and have a nice sharp point when you go through it. So you just want to clip off that corner edge and make sure you don't cut through your stitching line, because then you're going to have to start all over again and sew your corner again. Once you have all your corners clipped, you can just stick your hand through the opening that we left on the bottom of the page, and you want to reach out to the back and grasp that seam, and then just pull it all through until you have the right side of the fabric sticking out. And they make tools where you can get a nice perfect corner, but I usually just use my fingertip to sort of push out that corner as much as I can. Again, this is a project for a little kid. They're going to gnaw on it, they're going to pull at it. It really doesn't matter if it's absolutely perfect for them. They're just going to love that they have it and that you made it. So go ahead and push those corners out until your book lies nice and flat, and then we're going to take it over to the iron. Now it's time to press this book flat, and all those crazy bumps and folds are going to get ironed right out now. A little bit of spray starch is your friend when it comes to this process, as well as a steamy iron, so make sure you have plenty of water in there. So what I do is I kind of start up in this top corner, and I use my fingernails to press that seam all the way out to the edge, and then I just put the hot iron over it, getting that good and flat, and then I just work my way down the rest of that top panel, getting that all good and flat. Next, you want to turn and do your 2 sides, because these are the remaining sides that are fully sewn together, because remember that bottom we left that opening for turning that we're going to have to close up later. Just give that a good press open. And if your corners aren't perfectly square, that's okay. Don't worry about it. The baby certainly won't when you give it to them to play with and read. All right, now for the bottom. Now one side is already sewn together, so that one's easy. Just press that as we've been pressing all the rest, but stop once you get to the center. All right, now this is the only part that's just a tad bit tricky. It's sort of eyeballing where the seam is going to be. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press the part of the corner that is sewn together. But I'm still leaving this opening open here. So I'm grabbing a pin and I'm going to turn in those edges, and I kind of just put my fingers in where the edges, where the opening is, and then I just sort of pull them apart, and then the fabrics just kind of want to turn in on their own. And then I kind of use my thumbs to flatten it down until we get to the center, and then I just stick a pin in, making sure that I'm going through all layers. Then I hold that nice and flat and make sure to press that seam with the iron, and that will keep it in place until we're ready to stitch that closed by hand. If you want, you also could use steam a seam here, and then you wouldn't have to hand stitch that in place. Now this panel is still pretty wrinkled, and we need to do something about that before we're ready to put everything together and finish this book up. So what I'm going to do first is spritz it with some spray starch. That'll help everything lie nice and flat. And then I'm working 1/2 at a time, just kind of running my iron over it, flattening it out. And again, you didn't do anything wrong to make it be wrinkly like this. It's just the way it's printed on the fabric. This is just a step to make everything nice and flat when you put it together. It's not having to fix a mistake. Once you're done with one side, it's always a good idea to flip that over and just run that over with your iron too. This one should be pretty flat after you worked on the other side, but this is just a nice little finishing touch that will help make your book look more professional. Now it's time to pin the book together so that we can sew what will be the spine of the book. So in this one, I have different pages, they're different colors on the facing pages. So I'm going to use that as my line for the center. If that's not the case for you, then you can just eyeball it and it's a lot easier. So basically I'm just lining all these lines up so that they're all one on top of another. And then I'm going to put a pin through horizontally because I'm going to sew this way down the seam. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom, and I'll also throw a pin here in the center of it as well, just to kind of give myself an anchor as I'm going through. Now I still have my sewing machine set up with the walking foot and with the automatic setting for doing that reverse stitch when you get started. Now we start about 1/4 inch in or so, right down that center. And I always remove my pin. I really just kind of use that as a placeholder. And now I'm going to do some back stitching to reinforce those top stitches so that when you have a toddler pulling on this, it all will stay together. And then you just want to sew straight down the center until you come to the end, and then you want to reinforce your stitches again. Now we're done with the sewing machine, but we do have to hand stitch these openings closed. So I've already grabbed a thread and some needle, and we're going to get started on sewing those together. Now I'm going to whip stitch the rest of this closed. To do that, what you do is you take your needle. To do that, what you do is you take your needle and you put it in one side of the fold of the fabric, and you bring it out along the fold of the other side, about 1/8 to 1/4 inch away. And then you pull your thread taut. And then you just keep doing that until the opening is completely closed. And then you knot off your thread and you're completely done. So again, you just put your needle in through one side of the fold, bring it out through the other, and pull it tight. And that's all there is to it. And as soon as you finish stitching up your bottom openings, you are done and you have a cute little fabric book that your little one can enjoy. This is really a fast project. I didn't spend too much time off camera sewing, so you probably can get this done from start to finish in about half an hour. And again, it makes a great gift for your son or daughter, or your grandkids or nieces and nephews. Now let's see if it's kid approved. This is Angela, and she appears to like it. Do you like the book? Now, if you enjoyed this, oh, she also wants to play with pins. Gotta keep those out of the way. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please go to quiltaddictsanonymous.com and click on the tutorial section where you can find lots of other fun projects to do and instructions to follow. Look, it's a Labrador. Yeah. You like it?